I'd like to start off this week by making a slight retraction and apology for talking about The Wizard of Oz, and I really had not done enough research on the topic, and that was quite sloppy of me. And I felt it was a bit reckless to be talking about that film's production in a somewhat cavalier way. Judy Garland was 16 at the time of taping, and she went through, and with the intent of her being 13 as far as character-wise, and she went through a lot of shit on that film. There's books you can read. Judy Garland's autobiography is a good start on looking at that film. So I really should have just started off with 2 Muppet movies, but I guess that's what happens when I'm kind of working out what I'm doing. As we go, we live and learn. I was kind of just going, let's have some fun movies last week, and now it's actually, let's start doing a series on looking at what was the work of Jim Henson and his legacy, and essentially trying to provide a context for why the Happy Time Murders sucks, which we'll find out in a couple of weeks when I make Matt watch it. So to continue this Henson-y journey, we have gone from the Muppet movie, a film with heavy involvement by Jim Henson but no actual direction, to 2 films actually directed by him. The Great Muppet Caper from 1981 and The Dark Crystal from 1982. How are you, Matt?
Oh, I'm okay. I had no idea that Jim Henson directed The Dark Crystal. I must have completely missed that credit, and that's very surprising to me. So yeah, that's a new piece of information. Fun fact. Jim Henson actually directed The Dark Crystal.
Yeah, so that's what I'm trying to, with these first couple of weeks, just give a sense of the sorts of style and ideas that he had. And then we'll look at what happens when he's no longer alive to provide creative input into the Muppets as a franchise and as a set of characters. And then puppetry in general and the legacy of the company when they then try to make other creative works that aren't specifically part of the Muppets branding.
It is a little bit kind of insane. I don't know. The Happy Time Murders, is that the correct title?
Yes.
To that, it's kind of crazy to be here's all these Muppet films for the sole purpose of it's you must have really hated the Happy Time Murders a lot.
I did,
but yeah, but I'm kind of happy for it because it's been a fun journey. So it's at least I'm seeing lots of, at least mostly pretty good films so far on this journey. So I'm happy to be on this ride.
Yeah, I guess I should lay out that the next couple of weeks will be... Next week will be Muppets from Space from 1999 and The Muppets 2011. Then the week after that will be Muppets Most Wanted from 2014 and The Happy Time Murders. I was humming and hurrying about whether I do, since after The Great Muppet Caper in 81, we then get in about 87, I think, is The Muppets Take Manhattan. It might be 84. Let me look that up, so I'm not just being a lying fraud. Great Muppet... let's see... The Muppets... Films... No, yeah, 84 for The Muppets Take Manhattan. You then get this 8-year gap before The Muppet Christmas Carol. This leads to this period where the Muppets start becoming... And I'm trying to work out exactly how I frame this, but I think for the moment, the Muppets then basically become this troupe who do other people's movies, but it's these characters portraying the other characters. And while there's always meta-text, and oh boy is there meta-text in The Great Muppet Caper, there is a definite shift after Henson's departure from this world. From the Muppets as being a travelling troupe, or just a group of performers who will then be in films, and they might be providing their character to present and examine a certain genre, to specifically, these characters exist to very slightly adjust a text. So I'm going Muppets from Space because it's the only time in that period where they don't do that. They just have this film. And then we go on from there. So I guess before we really get into The Great Muppet Caper, something that came up is that Matt, he isn't quite familiar with the history of musicals and film. So this is, again, a fairly film studies one-ish topic. But basically, There's this opera. Obviously, opera is a major influence on musicals as a concept. You have a story told through singing on a stage. In particular, there's an opera in the late 19th century called La Bohème, which is one of the really big influences on the sorts of story structuring of musicals and the themes of musicals. There's this much greater focus on the values of innocence and the struggling poor trying to find a way to strive and succeed, which tends to pop up a lot in musicals. They often have, in a lot of musical theory, you'll get things like the heading out song, which will be the number which is all about the main character beginning to have some sort of quest, and that will usually be conveyed in song form. Things like that. But then, musicals as they enter film, particularly in American film, you really start to get this period throughout the first half of the 20th century, where the songs are often tangential to the actual plot. The most egregious example of this is a director called Busby Berkeley, who directed tens and tens of films and sequences in films. And all the films that he directed himself, you'll have scenes where people are talking to each other, and then just suddenly there will be a musical number. And it's often not even the characters in the scene who have the musical number. It'll just be like, they're operating a theatre, and now you watch the theatre do a dance for 4 to 5 minutes. And it's awful structure-wise. But the big legacy of him, beyond the fact that he made so many of these things, part of why he was able to, is the innovations he had in how you shoot a camera, and the choreography he designed was incredibly breathtaking. Just the costuming he would assign and the way he would get them to move. You just get these spectacular visuals, like these top-down shots of a huge mass of dancers in billowing gowns. And it would be like you're watching a kaleidoscope and turning the dial on the kaleidoscope to get different images. That's how crazy his productions looked. And then from there, you start to move to musicals like Singing in the Rain, where the characters are performing the numbers, but they're still not really related to the actual text that much. Like, you think about a film like in Singing in the Rain, there's things like the Moses Supposes song, where it's just someone made one quip about a vocal warm-up exercise, and now we'll get this elaborate tap dancing routine because of this. And then from there, you look at things like, say, Renaissance Disney films, where there's this much stronger connection between the songs and the actual narrative and themes and mindsets of characters. And so with all this in mind, I think it might be a bit easier to understand why in 2003 a film called Chicago comes out based on a Broadway musical. And since this film specifically uses, not only does it frame its musical numbers as occurring entirely in Catherine Zeta-Jones's head as the way that she views the world, but is then a further reflection of that film's chief idea that justice can be obstructed through carny tactics, and that if you appeal entirely to ad hominem and the pathos of an argument, that you can get away with all sorts of shit through razzle-dazzle. And so, the Academy, which is predominantly actors, but also mostly just old people who have been in the industry for a long time, who recall the legacy of Busby Berkeley, and tend to have a poor opinion of musicals, and probably recall when musicals as a genre, as a big-budget blockbuster genre, died after Hello Dolly bombed. They then see this movie come out in 2003 that justifies the existence of the musical to them, that is why that they would vote it as the best film of the year. You there, Matt? Have I bored you too much?
No, I'm there. I'm sorry, I just didn't have anything to... I was just interestingly listening to it. I think it's one of those things where, as I'm not that into musicals, but it's interesting to hear the history of them, because it kind of explains just the history of that genre, can kind of give you an idea of how Hollywood works in general. So it's just, that's why I think it's most fascinating to find things out about musicals, even if you aren't really into the genre in terms of actually watching them, if that makes sense.
I think I should clarify here that Hello Dolly killed the Hollywood musical blockbuster in 1969, which means that the Great Muppet Caper is somewhere between the 10 and 20 year rule, where there's this idea that every decade there will be certain layers of nostalgia that you can monetize off of. And so we see here that the Muppets, as we established with the Muppet movie, as a bunch of carnies who are making movies, and the Great Muppet Caper explicitly opens with a song where they state, "We are a movie. Here we are. We're getting prepared to make a movie. It stars us, the Muppets, and we'll all be playing roles that we have scripted." You can still sense that from there, this group that's producing a crime investigation movie, but also they're cashing in on a certain degree of nostalgia for this now dead genre of the Hollywood musical. And so from there, we get to the thing that drove you nuts about this film, which is its Hollywood musical numbers.
Yeah, it's almost two different movies. When it is being The Caper, it's really, really good, but when it's being that other movie, it's being that like old Broadway musical, it was just so boring to me. It's just, and that also just wasn't as interesting. Like there wasn't anything going on really with it, other than maybe like some technical brilliance in terms of like adding Muppets to this, like these huge dance numbers. Like I understand that there's like a technical brilliance there, but other than that, there was not much else going on in a movie. And especially after watching the Muppets movie, and also watching like the good scenes in this one, the Caper, like this, it can be an incredibly funny and engaging kind of, like there's an intelligence behind the people making these movies. So it's a shame that for like half of this movie, there's just very little else going on other than the visual, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and there are some very cool visuals I should highlight here. The one that always stuck with me as a child with this film is, of course, and it's funny because this is also the number that kind of has the most relevance to the film, where Miss Piggy has wound up as the star model in a fashion show, which is part of a plan by a crook to hoist some diamonds on her and frame her for theft. Then she imagines herself as being the queen of the world and the center of a synchronized swimming number. And there's this wonderful shot of her emerging from the water with already lit sparklers atop her head, which is of course achieved by you just drop a puppet into the water with sparklers on its head and you just reverse the footage. But it's so perfectly shot that you aren't thinking that when you see it. You just go, holy cow, she just broke reality.
I bet Miss Piggy could break reality. So, I mean, she is a queen. If anyone can do it. Yeah. I'm not quite sure. I feel like I want to talk about Miss Piggy after talking about her, but we're talking about the dance numbers, so I guess...
Oh, we can talk Miss Piggy.
Yeah. I just think that she's such a fantastic character. Like, there's obviously in both the movies that we've seen of the Great Muppet and these with these Muppet movies is that Kermit and Miss Piggy are at the center of them, and I think there's a perfectly good reason for that, and that they are the most interesting. They have the most going on under the surface.
Yeah, they're more than just a one or two note gag that you can then apply to different characters and make a variant on that gag.
Yeah, but like Miss Piggy, she's got this whole like extra like layer under her character where I just love the way that she presents this version of herself to the world in order to get ahead, and she's got this like princess queen, just really like happy kind of actress kind of vibe or model. And then, like, whenever anything happens to that kind of cracks away under that kind of facade is just so fantastic. Like, when she gets hit by, like, she, like, bumps into someone and she gets that really gruff kind of accent tone. When she's, like, when she goes to prison in this movie and, like, she knows all the lingo. She knows all the lingo for trucking as well. Like, you can tell, like, there's a very intelligent and, like, wily kind of character.
Oh, she's absolutely a girl from the streets who aspires for a level of feminine luxury, which society has never afforded her. And I guess in the meta text, she has entered showbiz in order to achieve this, and a lot of the narratives she appears in, it's then just various ways that she can then try to work her way into playing roles which allow her to pretend to be something that she's probably never going to be, unless she accrues far more capital than she actually has.
Yeah. I get the part where she's trying to essentially sneak into an like an old, like really rich, like British house, just so she can like play off being that rich, affluent kind of character. It's just, I kind of love her. I think she's probably my favorite Muppet character overall.
She is much to love.
Yeah.
I also love that these early films, and I'm bringing this up because I think it'll come up in one of the other films we do, is we're using terms like streetwise to describe her, but there's times where Miss Piggy is used to use fat jokes in the coming decades, and you don't need to do that with her. It's a kind of shitty way to view her, and ultimately winds up simplifying her far down into being essentially someone who does things out of greed rather than being the product of a culture which has developed certain sorts of things that you should be aspiring to be.
Yeah, that's a shame. I'm sad to hear that, because that really is just that would be such a huge simplification of a character that has so many aspects to it. To just say, oh well, she's greedy and she's fat. Like that would be. I hope I don't see too much of that on this journey.
Yeah, it's going to be interesting to see how much of it pops up that I can recall. But you brought up the John Cleese scene, and I think we need to talk about this scene because it's wonderful, and it reaches to a style of humour which we hadn't yet seen before in the Muppet movie, where beyond just the sorts of quick puns or these brief moments of subverting expectations through just passive aggression a lot of the time, here we have a scene which really reaches to a whole new level of absurd. Miss Piggy is climbing out the outside of a house, which is fine because, of course, it's part of her character that she's pretending to be a rich woman who's trying to impress Kermit. But most of the scene is John Cleese and his wife. I am going to do some big editing of this bit because I have forgotten who... Oh, yes, it's Joan Sanderson, who played off John Cleese in some Fawlty Towers and things from memory. Anyway, so John Cleese is married to Joan Sanderson, and they're having the most awkward dinner, where you very clearly get this little sketch indicating that these are two people in a miserable, loveless marriage who barely speak to each other, don't know who each other are. John Cleese is an overbearing husband who essentially keeps his wife locked up in the house because he perceives that that is the ideal way that a wife should be, and things like this are being touched on in this incredibly dry British way. And every now and then you just hear him say, oh dear, I think a pig's climbing the outside of our house. And then they no-sell it. So you just have, like, this scene goes for like 5 to 10 minutes, and it wraps around from being hilarious to awkward to painful to hilarious. It does that loop like 4 times. And then when you finally think it's going to be done, suddenly then John Cleese is chasing Miss Piggy around the house. And when he finally meets her, she just asks for directions to a good restaurant, and he politely gives them to her and lets her leave. It's
so magical, and I think it was that was one of the scenes that really got me into the movie, just because there was a few dance numbers and I was getting a little bit bored, and then that sketch comes out and it's magical. And especially because I'm not usually a big fan of awkward humor. I usually get awkward myself and don't really see the humor in it, but this worked perfectly for me. Yeah.
Yeah, it's the sort of scene that I'm not sure many other directors or writers or even producers would allow, because there's this weird dark tone to it. It serves barely any purpose in the grand scheme of the story, but it's so worth every second.
Yeah, because usually when they'd have a sketch like that, it'd be between two Muppets, and so that's why, like, even if it doesn't have too much relevance to the main story, it's like, well, these are the, like, especially in like the first movie,
the audience
the
is
Muppets
paid to
movie.
see some puppets and see them do semantics.
Yeah, so like, I feel like this scene would be pretty analogous to like them to Kermit finding the musical troupe, or just finding like other Muppets on the way, or like the car salesman with what's the biggest Muppet
Jack.
called again? Jack, yeah, stuff like that. It's instead of being Muppets, it's literally just this old British couple that seem like completely jaded with life.
You know what else is great? There's a scene in this movie where Kermit the Frog has found out that he was being deceived by Miss Piggy, and so he's sitting on a bench despondently. And before I get into... let me check something here. I'm trying to remember who it is that is sitting down next to Kermit. There's two layers of amazing jokes throughout this sequence. A sequence that's kind of killed by, again, a musical number, which, much like every other musical number, gets in the way. Although it does allow for this very long sequence of many, many, many puppets operating bicycles independently. Which is really, and it feels like, it's perhaps the most movie sequel-y moment in the film. Much like how, in private, we've joked before about how Dark Souls 2 has this fight with the Belfry Gargoyles, which is the most video game sequel moment in video games. As a fight which previously had 2 gargoyles now has 8. And this is, hey, you remember that short scene where Kermit was on a bicycle in the Muppet movie? He is every Muppet on every bicycle at once. But anyway...
There's a real showing off feel to a lot of the dance numbers and just general puppetry in general. And I guess this is going to go over to when we start talking about Dark Crystal, this idea of like, is something that is technically brilliant in it of itself good to watch. Like, there's a lot of stuff here that, while you can say, wow, that is amazing, there's a lot of times thing where you wonder whether having a better director or more of an editor for Jim Henson they might have been able to tell him, this is technically brilliant, but not really adding to the movie.
But you know, what does add to the movie in this sequence? First, there is a joke where Kermit is sitting despondently on a bench, and then this old wise fella, this old jaded New Yorker, they're in the middle of London, and the most New York man to ever New York sits down next to him and gives this noir-esque rant about how the American dream is a lie and will destroy everything that you hold precious in your life. And then, with the punchline being, so you got that because you tried to get into the glass slipper business, didn't you, kid? And Kermit says, No, the girl I was interested left this slipper, and we're trying to shoot a movie here, please go away. And this is then followed by him then running into Miss Piggy, and they're having a conversation, and halfway through the conversation, it becomes clear that they've used the wrong take in the final cut of the film. Because Miss Piggy forgets a line, and then Kermit starts giving critical feedback as the director about the methods that she's using to act in this scene, and how maybe she needs to tone it down a notch. And the cinematography doesn't change or anything. Perhaps the one thing you could do to enhance this and really indicate that it's a bad take of the film would be to have a boom mic drop into frame, but that's just because boom mics dropping into frame is my favorite visual gag of all time. But there's this playing with the meta text once again for a Muppet movie, which really feels a bit more refined than what the first one was going for, and really shows that they're really getting a feel for how you can achieve this sorts of humor without just staring at the camera and saying, we're breaking the fourth wall.
Yeah, that was such a great example of, as you say, breaking the fourth wall, and that meta scene where Miss Piggy is just completely, well, according to Kermit, is overacting in the scene, and just their back and forth banter is just like Kermit gets a couple of real zingers in that scene that is just fantastic, where Miss Piggy is saying that I'm putting on 100 emotions here, and he's like, well, let me just try and get one right. Yes. I'm saving the movie. Well, save your performance instead. And I think especially because we were talking before about how Kermit has, as well as, well, even in this podcast, we were talking about how Miss Piggy's got some stuff under the surface. Kermit does as well, obviously, where he seems very mild-mannered and generally a kind person. And I do think that's his core personality, but there's obviously a side to him as well that is willing to let it.
Everyone's shit.
Yeah, he can throw out some pretty nasty criticism if he wants to, And in that scene, yeah, he just goes after her, and it's just so funny, and it's always interesting to me see when meta or breaking the fourth wall works compared to when it doesn't, because in this scene it absolutely does.
Yeah, and I think for an example which doesn't quite work is there's a bit where Miss Piggy's driving a truck and she runs out of fuel and she'll never get to the museum in time to stop the diamond heist now. There's some great jokes along the way, like road signs that you just say about 2 hours to get to this specific museum and just a bit further. And, like, you'd expect that from homemade signs to advertise a place, but no, these are proper state-funded signage that say this. That joke's great. And what's also great is when the truck runs out of fuel, she's frustrated, but then another truck containing stunt goods drives by and conveniently drops a motorbike right next to her, which is a really good joke, and I think would have been accentuated if she just looked at the bike and then looked at the camera. But she then has to then be quippy and say, oh, how convenient, and I think that mars that joke a bit.
Yeah, because like with what we were talking before with Kermit and Miss Piggy, like having the banter about her performance, like they don't look at the camera at all. They're just like arguing amongst themselves. So
yeah, it's just a bad take.
Yeah, and with that, she actually does acknowledge the audience, so it loses a bit of its magic. I think you're right. I would have loved the idea of her. Even if she didn't even look at the camera, like I kind of like the idea if it was just like a silence as like the bike drops off and she just looks at it. And then you just see her start running towards, like, okay, I'll take that. It's like that probably would have been funnier.
Yeah, there was a number of times where the first Muppet movie would take that approach. Those jokes we talked about last week, where you have to let it rest for a bit, and then you go, "Wait, did they just do that?"
Yeah, you don't want to wink too much of the audience, and you want to respect their intelligence. Like we didn't need Miss Piggy to tell us that it was such a big coincidence. She didn't need to wink at us. She didn't need to engage with us at all, really. It would have been funnier without.
So all round, I mean, we're getting a bit nitpicky here, and I think that demonstrates that this is still a pretty good film, and I think we've got a good feel for what the comedic side of Jim Henson looks like.
I would say that if we are completing our thoughts on Muppet Caper, I would say that I would recommend it. If you haven't seen it yet, especially if you're by yourself, because then you can just skip past most of the boring bits with the Broadway musical stuff. You can just fast forward, literally, and you can get to the parts of the film that
get back to the movie.
Yeah, and when the movie is being the movie, it is really fantastic, and I think it had to be, because often it's probably more a criticism myself, but like if I'm not enjoying something, I tend to kind of just zone out of it, and if there's like good stuff afterwards, like I kind of miss it. I think it says a lot that this movie lost me in the first half of it, because that's where most of the dance numbers are. But once it starts being a movie again, you're immediately back on board. Like, I wasn't quite into the movie, and the dinner sketch happens, and suddenly I'm back into it, and there was a few more dance numbers, and I was like, ugh. And then suddenly the bench scene happens, and it's able to draw you back in through just sheer brilliance. Yeah.
So from there, we move to a film that is also technically brilliant, The Dark Crystal. A film that is constructed entirely out of puppets, also directed by Jim Henson. The original intent and the first test screenings of this film, since it's a fantasy world with entirely non-human characters, it was originally taped with a fictional language that sounded somewhat like Klingon, and subtitles over the course of it, and basically no narration, But this tested really badly with audiences, because why do you want to watch a movie with subtitles? I don't want to read while I watch things, etc. And so what began a bit of a curse, since Frank Oz was the co-director on this one, as always a big Muppet collaborator, and this would not be the first time Frank Oz would have trouble with test screenings, because Little Shop of Horrors the musical, when turned into a film, would also have a very dark ending, which tested really poorly and was completely cut out, and was thought to be lost for decades. It was sometime in around 2012 that some more reels of it were found, allowing the Blu-ray release in 2014 to actually restore the proper ending to the film, which makes much more sense for that film. Anyway, sadly there's no such luck with The Dark Crystal. There is a fan-made edit of the film, which uses a bunch of VHS footage and as much raw footage as they could find to try and recreate the original cut of the film, but there's no actual version of it. And so we wind up... And this is all a shame because it adds a lot to the atmosphere of the Dark Crystal. And the atmosphere is really, really important because the plot of the Dark Crystal is the most basic bitch hero's journey with baby's first Taoism themes slapped on top.
Yeah, the actual plot of this movie is incredibly boring, and and it's one of those ones where the villains are the most interesting part of the film because the heroes just have no character. The actual plot, you're just not invested in it at all, and I think it's always, or usually, a bad sign when you're kind of like rooting for the villains just because the heroes are so boring, and that's what happens with Dark Crystal.
Yep. To give an example of how lame the actual plot of the Dark Crystal is, the hero's low point, where they're at their worst and all hope is lost, is some rocks fell on him.
Yeah, I actually... This is strange that it reminded me almost a little bit of Ghazi's Wing.
Yes.
In just how, like, it's not quite as bonkers as Ghazi's Wing, but it has little bits where it goes through arcs of the story or arcs of a particular character at times so quickly and efficiently that there's no room for them to breathe or nothing to it other than just like, it feels like a very efficient, like, okay, this character is feeling bad now or guilty or doesn't really want to do something, and then in the exact same scene they'll be like, okay, actually no, I don't feel so bad, or actually no, I need to do it. Like there'll be a scene where he's like, I can't go and do this big really basic adventure alone, and then like in the next breath, it's not even in the next, like at the end of the scene,
next
it's
line.
yeah, it's like, oh well, alone. It's like, oh, okay.
Yeah.
It's like that call to adventure that is of usually not accepted at first, but then is like, it's like, oh, it's not accepted, and then immediately accepted straight away after. It's just like going through the motions in such a ludicrously efficient way.
And this is a part of why I brought up the original cut, because there was a lot less dialogue in that cut. A lot of the dialogue, particularly with the hero, Jen, is very clearly ADR'd in post. And so if you think about like the first act of this film, without the narration and without the internal monologue of Jen, then you can see how a lot of these scenes actually are quite good at conveying a mood and a tone. And it's not until he meets Ogren that he actually learns what the plot of the movie is.
Yeah, you have to really put on your imagination cap here, because like I've seen a version of the movie that is now in my head, and like, yes. I couldn't like deafen myself to the dialogue while I was watching.
Which is sad because the very first scene of this film, if you just go in with just the Trevor Jones score and the camera establishing this desolate wasteland with this black spiky castle, and then you move in and you see these vulture dinosaur rat people staring at this purple crystal that shoots out beams of light into their eyes as they raise their hands, and you go, this movie is metal as fuck. And that, of course, that's also part of the problem here, is that the first thing you see is the Skeksis having their heavy metal dark seance, and you're immediately thinking, man, I am so down for this mood right now, that when you then go back to the friendly mystics and the Gelfling Jen, and they're playing some panpipes and making some friendly chanting, it's nowhere near as charismatic.
Yeah, this is the worst kind of the villains are more interesting than the heroes kind of situation where, and you know, you're right, it sets you up with a tone that you either like or don't like, but it's the tone that it's set up. Like, it's this idea that you think you're going to be in like some crazy 80s action, like schlock kind of thing. And then when it turns into just such a very basic, boring adventure tale, it just feels so much lamer than what you could be getting.
Yeah, and I think this is a big thing of what makes the legacy of this film so complicated, is that if you are 8 years old, then all the strongest visual moments are going to stick out to you. And this is very much a film which, for people who espouse a love for 80s nostalgia and marketers who wish to capitalize off of 80s nostalgia, it's very easy to grab those few moments and construct this narrative of this being this unsung bit of creative genius. And I really want to stress here that I'm just referring to the scripting here being bad, because the visuals I find to be incredibly captivating. They're incredibly intricate. We've got like underwater puppets that emerge out of a swamp. You've got these very long elaborate takes where there's no puppeteers in sight, and it's very clearly not robotic animatronics. It's just all being operated through very clever cinematography to obscure where puppeteers are, or just making use of film grain to obscure when the fishing line is manipulating parts, as well as like the Garthim, the large robot crab spider minions.
I love them so much.
Yeah, the Dark Souls enemies.
I want to fight them. I want to be that hero, Zed or whatever his name was, and I want to fight those things in a video game at some point.
And not only are they looking so great, you get this final wonderful moment where they're still moving around and panicking as the crystal is made whole and all the evil is about to be purged. And they collapse and they're completely hollow inside. And you go, man, there's so much technical wizardry going on in this film. But the impression that I got from you while you're watching it is that this film visually made you very uncomfortable.
I think there was a lot of scenes, sometimes it would look fantastic. But I think a lot of times it would really lean into just how nasty looking everything was. It's like it got you so into like the mood and the atmosphere of some very ugly situations. Like I know I'm thinking of like the way the Skeksis would eat, or just like I don't know. It was a very unclean and dirty feel to a lot of things. So while that's obviously what they were going for and they did it really well, it just means like it leaves you kind of feeling a bit uncomfortable, which would be fine if the actual story of the movie was also maybe a bit uncomfortable, or it was more like that 80s kind of like schlock kind of story. But it would just kind of think it just like there was no reason for it, considering how basic kind of happy adventure story it was. That's all really for me.
Yeah, not only is it a very basic story, its approach to Taoism is a very basic one as well, where it introduces the idea that the Skeksis and the mystics, so the Skeksis are beings of pure evil and the mystics are beings of pure good. And there's various moments throughout the film, and you even went aha at one of them, where it makes it clear that the Skeksis are a one-to-one match for the mystics, and they are in fact intrinsically spiritually tied. And as the dark crystal which powers them is made whole again, they then remerge into being singular beings, which then ties into the idea that no one's fundamentally good or evil, everyone has bits of both inside them, and that true enlightenment and true reality is achieved when you understand how to keep those elements of yourself in harmony. But the rest of the film doesn't really tie into that as concepts. You've got these two blank slates who just kind of mill around, and then the man fixes the crystal, and then, like, hooray, you've made us whole again. But Jen hasn't really learned anything about the darkness inside himself, and how this is a thing that helps inform who he is and gives him a further greater compass for how to use his own sense of morality. There's nothing of that. He's just kind of doing his thing, and even then, it is the woman in his life who achieves most of... Yeah, Kira achieves most of the actual action in this film. That's something. I'm segueing into a different thing here, which is this film does a thing that a lot of films of that period do, where you want to give the woman agency, but you're concerned that a producer's going to get mad that it's not about the boy being the hero in their product that will sell toys to children. And so what you do is you have the woman do everything up until the very last visual moments of the film, in which case the man gets to do one thing, and thus they can say, look, he's the hero. And thus you can introduce these ideas of female agency without making it pure text. And a part of where contemporary feminist critique of this sort of thing will occur is that we've moved to a point where you shouldn't need to have to do that anymore. You can just have the woman who's clearly the main character actually be explicitly the main character in the framing as well.
Yeah, well, they add nothing to themselves. Like their relationship doesn't add anything to the story. The fact that there's two of them. At
least they don't kiss.
Doesn't. Yeah,
because Ben does not earn that.
Yeah, I think if you had just had the movie, there's no reason to have two of them because they don't add anything as a two. So if you decided to just say at the start of the film instead of Jed, if he just wasn't in the film and he just had Jen, sorry, and then you had Kira there instead and she just did the movie, it would be just as good as they add nothing by adding a second character. So it really does feel like, oh, well, we need to have the male character. And so, as you say, he does have to just do the final act of the story, even though before that he adds nothing to it, which is less than great. And I also think that I really do find it interesting, this idea that there's like this overarching story of, you have good versus evil, but to actually make reality whole, you have to have them come together, and the fact that it's not seen in Jen at all. I feel like that's because there's nothing in him in general. There's no kind of light or darkness in him. There's no character to him. And
he makes one bit of snarky comment early on, and that's it.
Yeah.
And that, again, feels like, hey, we need to fill in some audio here. So it feels a bit more of like the trademark Henson and Oz wit and Berman and so on.
Yeah, you would think that, and not just him, you would think that'd be, if that was the theme of your whole story, that would be present in all the characters, not just in Jen, but every character that he meets on his journey, that he sees that these characters do bad and good at the same time. And the problem with the Skeksis and the Mystics, that's the...
yes.
Yeah, the problem with them is that they don't have that balance. And it'd be great as well if you could see you could kind of see it if you look really hard, because the Mystics obviously have been mostly defeated. It seems like the Skeksis are in control of most of the world, even though there's not very many of them left. I think they could have delved a little deeper into that. The problem with the Mystics is that even though they're so-called good, clearly the problem with them is they're unable to exert very much at all influence on the world. So you kind of show that both the Mystics and the Skeksis are missing something important to them, and that's why they can't be who they probably should be. So it fails, if that overarching story fails in general, and also fails its characters as well.
Now, of course, all these sorts of flaws are what kind of mount up to this being a thing that wasn't able to really achieve a sequel. I think that a weird dark film like this, like a film that's very visually dark, would have been able to achieve some degree of success, or at least really, really inspired a certain level of love, even greater than there are certainly fans of The Dark Crystal, but it's not quite this thing that you would really spend decades constructing a grassroots fan campaign to push for more content of. Rather, it's one where investors just sometimes will look and say, hey, what is an IP from the 80s that we haven't in mind yet for nostalgia sales? And that is the sort of reason why we are now going to be getting, at the moment it's getting photography. There is a Netflix series which is going to be 10 episodes long based on this. So we have this deeply flawed, mediocre script attached to this world that you can do a lot with. And now, 30 years on, we are finally actually going to get some more material that really explores this further. There's been some books, there's been some comics, but there's been no actual puppetry visual media expanding on things. And I think there's a lot there. We're seeing here, there are ideas present in the film that are poorly explored. And so now, moving on, we'll finally be able to actually see some of that happen.
Yeah,
and is that something you would be interested in seeing in the context of having seen this film?
I think the two arguments that are in my head that are competing with each other is, yes, there are interesting ideas that could be seen in the Dark Crystal, but there's nothing to the world or to its characters that suggests to me that if you wanted to follow up on those ideas, that you actually need to remake it or make a sequel, however they're doing it. Like, you could literally just say, we kind of think there's some interesting stuff here in Dark Crystal. Let's just make a spiritual sequel, or let's try and use that for something new. And I don't see why you would need to remake this at all. Like, there's nothing to it. That's just to me that, like, this is an IP that...
I'm just saying more stuff in the setting.
In the setting.
Yes.
Yeah, I guess. I don't know, I just don't see much... To me, all this movie is, in terms of the goodness, is its technical brilliance. Like, there's not, like, in terms of, like, oh, it's a story of good and evil and the balance between them, or the actual landscape itself is, like, just like apocalyptic and desolate, and all, like, crazy creatures and stuff like that, which are kind of fun to see. Like, none of that is... I just don't see why you couldn't just do another IP if you wanted to make... I'm guessing that this new Netflix thing will be puppets, I'm guessing.
Yep. That was confirmed at New York Comic Con a few weeks ago, actually.
And that's, like, the most exciting thing to hear. Like, if they just said, we want to make a big puppet show in, like, maybe the vein of the Dark Crystal, then I'd probably be more interested. I just don't really see the reason for the name, really. Because it doesn't evoke anything. It doesn't evoke any character, doesn't really evoke much in the setting, doesn't evoke very much in terms of theme, because the themes are so basic that it's, yeah.
No, that's fine. So I think that's kind of where I'm going to leave things for this week. That I think we've got some idea of Jim Henson being someone who, when he's working with metatext, then he can be quite clever. But when it comes to focusing on the technical, he can get too carried away in purely the technical aspects of a production and let the writing suffer as a result.
Yeah, he's I think you might enjoy... I think he's a carny. He knows the tricks, and he knows the technical things to do, but the actual doing something that has a bit more to it, like some emotive or some really, like, more nourishing themes, I think he struggles a little bit more with. And I kind of went, oh yeah,
I think this is a part of... So there's this series which had 2 seasons called The Storyteller, which Jim Henson directed, which is about John Hurt and Brian Henson voicing a dog. And John Hurt, with a bunch of neat prosthetics on his face, sits by a fire and tells a bunch of adaptations of folk tales. And they went really obscure with a lot of the folk tales. We're talking like Russian stories about a man who puts death in a sack. And they all have... much like the Dark Crystal, they want to go dark. But much like the Dark Crystal, they also often wind up pulling their punches a bit. And so for every man who holds death in a sack and faces the consequences of people living in perpetual suffering but unable to have the relief of death, there's then a bunch where it's like, girl gets saved by a lion from evil troll. And often winds up... I feel that there's this certain level of Henson wasn't quite willing to go all the way with ideas and with concepts and with tone in a way that would have made him really, really stand out as a truly great filmmaker, not just a great visual artist. And I think that this is going to be a bit of the legacy that sticks with the Muppets as we get into the films made after his death.
Yeah, and I wonder whether that's also the carny in him, the businessman, who's like, if we go too dark, we might not get the same amount of butts in the seats as we might otherwise do.
And so we shall see where this all leads next week, I think.
Yeah, let's continue this journey.
Alrighty, let's go then. See you next week. Bit of a call.
See ya.